This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on Monocle Radio on the 2nd of November 2024. Hello, I'm Vincent McAviney, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, ahead of the US election on Tuesday, producer and investigative journalist Hannah Cogan joins the programme to reflect on the week's news and look ahead to what the final days might bring. Then,
this is perhaps one of the most defining elections of our time. I think it will really signal where the West is headed, and whatever happens on November 5th will dictate the future for the rest of the world.
We hear from Monocle's team on the ground in Atlanta, Georgia, a key swing state ahead of the election. That's all ahead on Monocle on Saturday with me, Vincent McAviney. First, though, here are the day's main news headlines. Spain has deployed a further 500 soldiers to the Valencia region amid rising criticism of local authorities' response to the catastrophic flooding earlier this week. More than 200 people have died and the death toll is expected to continue climbing. Thousands of volunteers have travelled to the region to bring supplies and help with clean-up efforts. Both Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris campaigned in key swing state Wisconsin on Friday night, holding dueling rallies in the city of Milwaukee. Harris was joined by rapper and actress Cardi B, whilst Trump again had repeated technical failures with his microphone. And Botswana is set for its first change of governing party in 58 years, after President Masisi conceded defeat to Umbrella for Change's leader Duma Boko in the general election. Mr. Masisi's Botswana Democratic Party has held power since independence from Britain in 1966, but came fourth, with voters dissatisfied at rising unemployment as the southern African nation's diamond exports have faltered. Well, hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday. And even though this election has dragged on for much of the past 2 years, it feels as though it's coming to a sudden end, with the polls a complete mismatch of predictions. Along the way, there have been remarkable plot twists, Trump subverting the entire Republican primary process to clinch the nomination, his conviction as a felon over his business dealings and being found liable of serious sexual assault, Joe Biden dropping out in a late-stage swap to Kamala Harris, a rogue Kennedy, and there being not one but two close attempts on Trump's life. If it had been scripted as a drama, it would have been deemed too far-fetched and been thrown out. I'll be heading to cover the election from Wisconsin this week, along with Monocle's Georgina Godwin in South Carolina and Chris Chermak in Washington, D.C. We'll be bringing you all the latest news and the best analysis across our programmes in the coming days. But this morning, I'm pleased to say I'm joined in the studio here at Midori House by producer and investigative journalist Hannah Cogan. Hannah, welcome to the programme.
Nice to be here.
It's been a busy time for you. You've been working on lots of projects. How are you feeling going into this final week of the election?
Oh, it is too close to call. I think at this point, anyone who claims they know what's going to happen is probably best not listened to. It is tight everywhere, and we've never really seen an election come quite this close to the wire before. So it's going to be a fun week.
It will be, and I think potentially it will be extending it beyond this week because I'm going to talk about the legal warfare that's coming. But first of all, looking through the stories, there are obviously the papers are full today of lots of election stories. But you've picked out this one about the post-election challenges and also Elon Musk and his disinformation campaign.
Yeah, there's lots of really interesting stories doing the rounds at the minute about various lawsuits that have been filed in various states, particularly in swing states, both suits by the Republicans alleging voter fraud, voter suppression. We've also seen countersuits from the Democrats, which is really interesting. They are all sort of there to lay out legal challenges that we're going to see fought in the coming weeks. So the election itself is a starting point. We think this is going to be a bit like 2000. It's going to go right down to the wire. Which votes we do and don't count are going to be arbitrated in court. So we're starting to see that spread now. We've also seen lots of fun podcasts come out this this week with allegations one way or the other that the vote might be rigged or stolen, or conversely, completely fine. All of the things that you'd typically listen to around this time on the Republican side, Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro have all been doing some pretty heavy lifting, suggesting that the election's going to be a steal. We've also seen the Democrats take to some more traditional media channels, NPR particularly, to talk about why that's not going to be the case.
Well, what's interesting is, this laying the groundwork for a challenge no matter what. It does show perhaps a lack of confidence in their own candidate. Or do you think they're just trying to create a sort of fog of war so no one really knows what's going on?
So I think it sort of slightly depends which party you're looking at. The Republicans definitely are looking at a bit of a fog of war, right? You're looking to kind of generate political momentum like we had in 2020 and actually to a certain extent during the midterms in 2022. If it could be fraud or it could be faked or there might be an issue, you start generating that kind of public pressure. The Democrats, conversely, are in a bit of a bind. They're trying to prove that everything is fine, and trying to prove a negative is always a little bit more difficult. So it pays for them to get out early and make sure that courts, independent organizations, are finding that the voting process is completely secure.
And someone not helping with all of this is Elon Musk. He is sowing misinformation left, right and centre. I mean, a lot of people, back 2 years ago when he bought then Twitter, now X, were completely confused by it. It didn't make financial sense. But we know he's been tweaking algorithms heavily, promoting pro-Trump content, his potential end game on this. Where do you think this throws this election from all the work that you've been doing in the US with voters across the country?
So I think why the Elon Musk thing is particularly interesting, right? Because you're talking to a very specific subset of American voters. And you're talking to voters who get their information in a very particular way and are typically not trusting mainstream media, are not trusting sort of traditional election information channels. And you're also looking at activists who are likely to share information about votes, elections that they see in their communities nationally, which is why we see a lot of the stuff going out on X at the moment is about long lines at my local polling station or a ballot box that was left out in the rain, that kind of thing. And it's much as we've talked about already, that same process of sowing distrust, sowing the idea that something might be wrong, even if you're not completely sure what it is. So that's what we're seeing at the minute, and it's going to get crazier and crazier.
Well, speaking of crazy, Bobby Kennedy has made a name for himself sort of globally in this election, and he has been spouting all kinds of mad things. He, of course, admitted to having a brainworm at one point. He talked about how he sort of killed a bear. His daughter came out and said that, he cut off the head of a beached whale and had it on top of the car. I mean, just to remind listeners, it has been quite a run from Bobby Kennedy Jr. But there are serious concerns about what he's saying, particularly this Madison Square rally last week where Donald Trump said that he might be put in charge of public health because he has some pretty out there views and some pretty scientifically illiterate views as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bobby Kennedy himself has said that Donald Trump has promised him control of the health department and also alluded possibly to some controls that would be stripped out of environmental regulations, for instance, which is really worrying. And we've had lots of environmental activists, lots of health activists in the U.S. really sound the alarm about this. Bobby Kennedy, as you say, has some pretty out there views. He's talked about seed oils as an example, some other commonly debunked healthcare theories as things that Americans shouldn't be exposed to. But it feeds back into that Trump agenda of trying to strip out regulation, strip out things that Donald Trump perceives as a barrier to business. What Bobby Kennedy does for the Trump campaign is twofold. He's a Kennedy, right? He's a part of a Democratic scion family. So as a headline, that's already really interesting. But he's also pulling in a really interesting subset of American voters, typically people who, again, don't believe traditional media, don't trust traditional establishments, in this case, medical establishments. And he's pulling in some of those more sort of wellness, self-sufficiency type voters into the Trump campaign, which is a really fascinating pipeline.
There's a dangerous side, though, as well, because he is anti-vax and wants to get rid of most vaccines. And we are seeing a drop in vaccine uptake since the pandemic, and it's leading to a rise in things we thought had gone away, like polio.
Yeah, which is very, very concerning. In the US, there was a lot of backlash to compulsory vaccines after COVID, and that actually came after a more general vaccine backlash anyway. The US was really primed to be receptive to this kind of message. But again, it feeds into a lot of really traditional Trump messaging about not trusting the establishment and not having other people make decisions for you.
Turning to another area that might struggle in a potential second Trump presidency, and that's the clean energy industry. We already know Donald Trump has some pretty strong thoughts on EVs, even though he's got Elon Musk as a backer, the creator of Tesla. What could he do to this industry, do you think?
Well, this is really interesting. Donald Trump has promised repeatedly to repeal Democrats call it the Green New Deal. He's called it the Green New Scam. And that covers a lot of subsidies, tax credits, things like that, that go to various clean energy industries in the U.S. That includes battery manufacture, wind turbines, things like that. And that's going to be a real problem for him, I think. What's interesting is that most of those factories, which cover a large and growing number of American jobs, they're really, really prosperous. And a lot of them are in Republican districts. So I think we're slowly watching the Republican Party wake up to how many jobs and how much money that is for the U.S. economy. Within the U.S., Americans tend to perceive the U.S. economy as struggling. So how it's going to
even though it's booming,
even though it's
gangbusters,
absolutely
on every
booming,
indicator doing
on
well.
every indicator doing well, the job market is hot, inflation is fine, but within the U.S. there are real perceived problems with the economy. And I think watching this play out in real time will be a bit of a wake-up to a lot of Americans about how much the Biden administration has achieved economically.
And what seems crazy with this is, I mean, this is the industry of the future, and you only have to look at, how big China is as a player in this. It's an industry all countries are trying to get into. And if he sort of suppresses it and crushes it and doesn't support it, well, you're going to have the exact same effect in, places like the Midwest, the former Rust Belt, once again, where they're left behind. These are the sort of manufacturing jobs of the future, and they're not involved in that sort of global race for them.
Not involved in the global race and also not involved in training a new generation of Americans to work in those factories and work in those industries. It's interesting that Donald Trump has made so much of this, particularly because he has talked about energy security and why that's important. And this is the energy security of the future as well. So you do worry that both sort of economically and in terms of skills training, parts of America that are already left behind will be left behind further.
And I mean, America didn't experience it as much as Europe did. The shock after the Ukraine war when, energy prices soared. America has been sort of insulated from that because of this sort of fracking and shale gas that they had. But that only, can last for so long. This really is the way to gain energy independence, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly when you look at geopolitical instabilities at the moment, which might have real ramifications for energy prices. It's an important sector to invest in.
And finally, Vimeo has picked a documentary this week about election integrity. Why did this stand out to you?
So I love this story. This is very sweet. And in the reporting that I've done in the past, we've talked in very broad brush terms about the integrity of American elections and the work that people put into and that institutions put into making sure that Americans trust their election process. What I think often gets lost in that conversation is the work of local election administrators across America. These are people who run small, locally community-tied voting offices. And just in the last sort of 4 to 8 years, we've seen their job get really, really hard. We've seen them increasingly exposed to things like death threats, to being doxxed, to their families being
targets. And these are just civic-minded people who want to make sure that elections run smoothly and fairly and freely.
These are county-level officials making about $60,000 a year who do their job because they love elections, they love democracy, they love people being involved in that process. And I think this film does a really wonderful job of highlighting the personal toll, not just the political toll, not just the kind of debate-based toll, but the actual physical toll this has taken on U.S. elections infrastructure. They've had issues with burnout. They've had issues with recruitment. And I think this just highlights that really this is a human-facing problem. Because
when I was in the election in 2020, I mean, we were at various count centres in Philadelphia because that was a sort of critical count. That was the one that eventually, that call made Biden the president. But, there were mobs of people outside threatening, being noisy. They had real security around around that building to stop anyone going in. And even for people leaving to go home, they had to sort of offer them sort of protection on the way to the car and everything. What we're seeing as well is that there are fewer vote counters volunteering this time because they feel under threat. At the extreme example, you had the two mother and daughter in Georgia who Rudy Giuliani went after. They sort of got a legal victory over him for defamation that he now owes them $150 million. I mean, things like that might actually slow down this election this time and make the count an even longer one.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen measures come in a couple of states suggesting that votes should be hand counted as well, which would really compound this problem. We are also seeing election offices struggle with the people who are now motivated to go and work at vote counts tend to be activists from either party, which then becomes a self-compounding problem in that people start to lose faith in the democratic process again. So I love this film. I would really encourage people to watch it. It gives a lot of heart, I think, to what can be a little bit abstract.
Well, we're going to have more from Hannah in a minute. But now the Monocle team have been dispatched to Atlanta, Georgia this week, one of the key swing states that will play an important role in deciding the results of the US election. Yesterday, Monocle senior foreign correspondent Carlota Rebelo and US editor Chris Lord spoke about their experience speaking to people on the ground.
Carlota, we've been in Atlanta, Georgia now for, 72 hours. We've seen a lot of leaf blowers, haven't we?
And heard them,
and we've heard them from far and wide. Initial impressions, thoughts, this is your first time in the city.
It's been amazing so far. And what I always find fascinating is when you arrive at a city at night, you never really get a sense of what you're about to encounter. So when I landed from London, I think I got in about 8 p.m. local time. So my drive into the hotel, I wasn't really sure what to expect. And then the next day, waking up, beautiful sunshine, we're overlooking the Ponsonby Market and seeing the Park Ponce Market around here, the area of the Beltline. And you suddenly just feel like this is a city where things are happening. You know, there's a reason why this is the fastest growing city in America and why it's attracting not only so much investment for companies relocating and people wanting to base themselves here, but also, you know, that movement prompted by the pandemic, perhaps, of people leaving bigger cities and moving elsewhere. I think Atlanta is still benefiting from it, which is quite nice to see. There's a lot happening.
There is a lot happening. It's worth setting the scene a little bit about where we are in Atlanta. So we're in the east side of the city, which, you know, really only a couple of decades ago was absolutely the wrong side of the tracks, was post-industrial. A lot of it was wasteland. And if it wasn't wasteland, then it was parking lots surrounded by barbed wire. Now they've turned an old railway line, much like the High Line, but much bigger in vision and scope, into an amazing thoroughfare for pedestrians. You know, we've been here for a few days now. There is just a non-stop stream of bikes, walkers, dog walkers, people hanging out, coming from bars and pubs all along this pedestrianised neighbourhood. So it's quite amazing. I think we're in a good spot to be seen. You know, when you came out here, Carlota, I'm curious about what you thought you might find in terms of the views that you hear. Because, you know, we're in a southern city. We're also in a swing state, possibly the most swingiest of the swing states for this election. It was so close last time. Less than 12,000 votes won it for Biden. What have been your thoughts? Have you had any surprises talking to people, kind of challenging maybe ideas about what you thought you'd hear in our interviews?
Yeah, so for sure, what I found immediately is the amount of adverts that you see, not necessarily for the candidates and the respective sides, but actually just telling people to vote, which I find is quite a particular difference here. Of course, you'll see adverts for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, but there's been a lot of engagement of getting out to vote and the appeal of the early elections, the appeal to make sure your voice matters. And in fact, earlier today, we were walking around this area here of the Beltline, just getting some supplies ahead of our broadcast. And there were two volunteers from Planned Parenthood, not necessarily doing any lobbying for the organization, but just asking, in particular, young black men, if they had voted, and if they didn't, scan this QR code and you'll find out how you can vote, when early voting until when it is open. And that level of engagement has been really interesting to see. As you said, Chris, it is a swing state, the state that everyone is watching. It can come down again to a matter of a few thousand votes. So this engagement of making sure we do not end up in a situation where people don't get out and vote is quite interesting. And earlier we heard from a former city councillor, Kwanza Hall, who was precisely talking about the danger if people don't show up.
That would be a travesty, and it would be very embarrassing because we have the numbers here. We have all of the intellect. I mean, there's nothing missing in a place like Georgia for the turnout to reach max potential. especially at the pace we're at right now. I mean, looking at the Secretary of State's numbers, we could be hitting on 3.567 by tomorrow, and election day we'd be at 5 million or so. That would be phenomenal. And that speaks, volumes to the amount of work that's going on behind the scenes. But also, I know black men, you said that, black men and young black men especially feel disenfranchised by American society. And that didn't just start in the last few years. How do you make sure that people feel they have a stake? And that's high prices, opportunity, access. VP Harris has rolled that out, but we also have to look at what is the biggest challenge. The justice reform piece, that's real. And that's nationwide. And we all know it's a travesty, it's documented, and it's taken so many lives backwards. And, being a person who championed the Beltline and championed all this great work, the community building type stuff that we did a few blocks that way, on Boulevard with the Yo Boulevard initiative, the area with the greatest concentration of poverty in the Southeast United States, 700 families, average income is $3,000 a year, like any developing nation, is right here. And this is the Beltline. So how do you make sure the young men and women who live there have the opportunity not to just go straight to jail?
Kwanza Hall there, former congressman for this exact district where we are right now, Carlota. I think this is the point, isn't it? In the run-up to this weekend and this crucial last few days, what you keep hearing is, and rightly so, all these fears about electoral violence, the potential of legal challenges that snarl up this whole process that maybe runs this way beyond Tuesday and Wednesday into maybe towards the end of the year with legal challenges, just like we saw in 2020. Maybe the more pressing concern is that people simply do not engage. They do not decide to come out on election day or before and made their voice heard. We only 6 months ago, we were talking about this election as a double haters election, where people just didn't believe in either candidate. Of course, there's been a few changes since then. The top of the ticket, and also the stakes have been higher with Donald Trump's 2 assassination attempts. But I still think there is a bedrock here of concern that people may simply not show up.
And it is that concern, and we need to wait for election day to precisely see the impact of that voter turnout. But what I think is interesting, and I don't know if you feel the same, Chris, which is by being here so far, the amount of people that have engaged with us and been curious about what we're doing, and the fact that we are here on the ground. And earlier we heard from someone who works closely with the American community abroad, and she was saying to us that she has never seen this level of interest or of engagement by the world.
Foreign press,
foreign press especially, in these elections. So this is perhaps one of the most defining elections of our time. I think it will really signal where the West, as a concept, not necessarily as a geographic description, where the West is headed. And whatever happens on November 5th will dictate the future for the rest of the world.
That was Monocle's senior foreign correspondent, Carlota Rebelo, in conversation with Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord, in Atlanta, Georgia. Tune in to Monocle Radio at 1800 London time, 1400 Atlanta time today for a US election special of the Monocle Daily to hear more from the team. And as I've already mentioned, I'll be out there in Wisconsin. Georgina Godwin's going to be out there in South Carolina. Chris Chermak is going to be in Washington, D.C. So we have you really covered across our programs this week for all the latest. Now, still with me today here in the studio is Hannah Cogan, the investigative journalist and producer. And we're going to move on to some lighter stories now. We're not fully moving away from the election yet. There's one fun one. What have you spotted? Some statues in Philadelphia.
This is a great story. There has been some really fun protest art doing the rounds in the US at the minute. I know Georgina's been posting some great ones onto her Instagram account as well for regular listeners to the program. But 2 great pieces popped up in DC, a bronze tiki torch and also a bronze replica of Nancy Pelosi's desk with what looks kind of like a giant poop emoji on the top. Both
hallmarking back to the 6th of January, the attack on the Capitol.
Yeah, absolutely. And that tiki torch harking back to the Charlottesville rally as well. Reminders, I think, of maybe what America could expect under a return to a Trump presidency. Interestingly, we don't know who the artist is. The Washington Post have had a call from a collective that they claim were behind the statues. There was a name on the permit, But apparently she had nothing to do with the art as it was constructed. So we still don't know.
Interesting. And speaking of Philadelphia, we were just talking about this off air. There is a native of Pennsylvania who I think we're all waiting to be deployed. We've seen Beyonce at a rally. We've seen Cardi B. We've seen J-Lo. There is one big megastar left to throw, isn't it? This is your atomic weapon at the end.
Taylor Swift. Do not underestimate the Swifties. We've heard rumors that she might be at a rally on Monday night with Kamala Harris, driving a get out the vote operation. So we'll wait and see.
I think she will be. If you've watched the Miss Americana documentary that she did on Netflix a few years ago, she very clearly regrets not speaking out in 2016 when she was still sort of beholden to the country music narrative of, stay down the middle of the line, don't alienate your listeners. She's now sort of transcended that into sort of just, Michael Jackson territory, global pop star. She's less concerned. And she clearly, she's already signaled support for Kamala Harris after the debate. So that would be pretty big for her on Monday night for Kamala Harris as her closer, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen after her Instagram posts, huge numbers of young women registering to vote, getting excited to vote. So it'll be exciting to watch.
Definitely. Now, moving on to those lighter stories that we mentioned. You are a big sailor, Hannah, and you spotted one about a shipwreck.
I love this story. One of the little-known facts about the Great Lakes in North America is that there are about 4,000 shipwrecks in the bottom of them. It's a common shipping route, so lots of traditional sailing ships are wrecked at the bottom of those lakes.
I did not think it'd be as many. I mean, that's, only in 300 years? That's quite a lot of shipwrecks.
Yeah, that's quite a lot of shipwrecks. People forget these are sort of sea-sized, right? If you stand on one side of these lakes, you can't see the other side. They're big bodies of water, and they were commercially important to trade between Canada and the US for many years. But a couple of scientists in the US have been extracting grain from one of these wrecks with the hope that they will be able to use it. It's a heritage variety of rye, which they were hoping to be able to plant right away, haven't been able to, but they're going to genetically sequence and use to make some whiskey, which should be extremely fun to taste, I imagine.
Very interesting. What's amazing about those lakes as well, I'm thinking, I've swam in sort of Lake Ontario, these massive lakes, and, they're fresh water. So they're not that buoyant if you're a swimmer as well. And, when you swallow it, it's not, you just expect it to be like the sea. They're sort of, they're not salty. They're fresh water. It's extraordinary. And it has, of course, been Halloween this week, and we've had our usual raft of Halloween stories. One from Paris first, and this is the zombie.
Yeah, this is the zombie. So there's a new exhibit up at the Quai Branly Museum in Paris that sets out to reclaim the zombie narrative and talk to goers a little bit about voodoo and where that tradition comes from. They're really keen to reclaim zombies not as the flesh-eating monsters that you and I know them as, but as a really important part of Haitian tradition. Zombies come out of a sort of parallel court system, parallel justice system that's existed in Haiti for hundreds of years, where people perceived of wrongdoing were enslaved as punishment for their crimes. That's the original meaning of zombie. And this...
I never knew that was where it came from.
It's amazing. A really, really fascinating area. So the idea was that if traditional justice was not available to you, you were taken to a voodoo court, you were found guilty, you were exposed to toxins that lowered your heart rate to almost zero, then buried, declared dead, and symbolically resurrected, whereupon you were enslaved. If you had failed to contribute to society, you were effectively kind of taken out of it, and then kept in slavery as punishment for your crime.
You just think, the dozens, if not hundreds, of movies about zombies. No one's ever explored. That's an incredible tale of the origin of where it comes from. Haiti has a fascinating history. It's quite a sad history for most of it. But that's amazing that no one's ever really explored the origins of the term.
Yeah, and you think zombies, we've all seen so many zombies this week in Halloween week. And we haven't really ever looked at where that came from. And we've also kind of conflated them in the West as well with vampires. Haitian zombies don't drink your blood. They don't try and eat you. They're not after your brain. So I think reclaiming that narrative and also reclaiming voodoo as a religion is a really important thing to a lot of voodoo practitioners. So it'll be a fun exhibit to go and see.
What's your favourite zombie film?
28 Days Later?
Okay, you've stolen mine. I was about to say 28 Days Later. That is a fantastic one. There's also an amazing series. It was Charlie Brooker, who writes, of course, Black Mirror. His first big TV project was called Dead Set. It was in the 2000s, and it's basically about the Big Brother house, a reality show, and what happens to the contestants when there's a zombie outbreak in the rest of the country. And it's got sort of Davina McCall in it. It's amazing. It's a really great, I think it should still be on the Channel 4 player, so I would recommend that. And just finally, a little story about bats.
This is adorable. So the U.S. Bureau of Land Management have started running a Bat Appreciation Week around Halloween. Bats got a bad rap after COVID. And
I'll never forgive them.
Was part of an effort to rehabilitate their reputation. They're obviously really important to ecosystems all over the world. So the U.S. Bureau of Land Management every year hold a bat beauty contest. You can get involved and go and vote for your favorites on Instagram. But the winner this year was a hoary bat named, wait for it, Harry Potter.
Fantastic. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for joining me. Your first appearance. Fantastic. That is all for Monocle on Saturday. Thanks to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan. My thanks to Hannah Cogan. Monocle on Saturday returns next week. I'll be here, fresh back from Wisconsin, with perhaps an election result, but I don't think so. Thank you very much for tuning in.